The world woke on May 24, 2024 to a heightened state of anxiety. Overnight, tensions in the Middle East, already simmering at a dangerous boil, escalated dramatically. A stark warning delivered via social media sent shockwaves from Washington, D.C. across the globe, landing with explosive force in the heart of Iran. The message from former U.S. President Donald Trump was unambiguous and chilling. It was a direct address to the citizens of Tehran, urging them to evacuate their city. This single act transformed a regional conflict into a potential global crisis, placing nations on high alert and leaving millions to wonder what the dawn would bring. The implications were immediate and profound, fueling fears of a wider war. This sudden escalation did not occur in a vacuum. For weeks, the Eastern Mediterranean had been a theater of conflict. Israel and Iran, long-standing adversaries, were engaged in an unprecedented exchange of fire. Missiles were crossing borders, striking strategic targets in civilian areas alike. The international community watched with growing alarm, making diplomatic overtures that seemed to have little effect on the ground. The fighting represented the most direct military confrontation between the two regional powers in decades. It was against this backdrop of open warfare that Trump's declaration was made, injecting a new and unpredictable element into an already volatile situation, raising the stakes for everyone involved. The message itself was a potent mix of threat and justification. Trump framed his warning around Iran's nuclear ambitions, a long-standing point of contention. He stated that Iran had failed to heed his previous calls to sign a nuclear deal, a failure he described as a disgraceful risk to human lives. The core message was clear. Iran would not be permitted to acquire nuclear weapons under any circumstances. The directive for the citizens of Tehran to flee their homes suggested that a significant military action could be imminent. This wasn't a subtle diplomatic maneuver. It was a public ultimatum broadcast for the entire world to see, leaving little room for interpretation. Global markets reacted with predictable volatility, and diplomatic channels buzzed with frantic activity. Leaders around the world were forced to respond to this new reality. Was this a calculated bluff designed to force Iran back to the negotiating table, or was it a genuine prelude to a devastating attack? The ambiguity of the situation created a dangerous vacuum filled with speculation and fear. The international media scrambled to provide clarity, with headlines everywhere reflecting the gravity of the moment. The world was holding its breath, caught between the possibility of a diplomatic breakthrough and the terrifying prospect of an all-out war that could engulf the entire Middle East. To understand the gravity of this moment, one must look at the complex history that underpins the conflict. The animosity between Iran and Israel is not a new phenomenon. It is a decades-old rivalry rooted in geopolitical competition, ideological differences, and a struggle for regional dominance. This long-standing Cold War has often been fought through proxies in places like Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. However, the recent events marked a dangerous shift from shadow conflicts to direct state-on-state military strikes. The exchange of missiles represented a crossing of red lines that both sides had previously been careful to observe, signaling a new and more perilous chapter in their relationship. The immediate catalyst for this recent flare-up was a series of targeted strikes and retaliations. While the exact trigger remains a point of contention, with both sides blaming the other for initiating hostilities, the result was a rapid and violent escalation. Israel reported attacks on its energy infrastructure and military bases, while Iran reported significant damage and casualties from Israeli airstrikes. This cycle of violence created a feedback loop of aggression, with each attack justifying a more forceful response. The situation was a tinderbox, and the ongoing strikes were the sparks threatening to ignite a regional conflagration that could draw in other global powers. The backdrop to this military confrontation is the long-running dispute over Iran's nuclear program. The 2015 nuclear deal, from which the Trump administration withdrew in 2018, was intended to curb Iran's nuclear activities in exchange for sanctions relief. Its collapse led to a renewed push by Iran to advance its program, while the US and Israel vowed to prevent it from ever obtaining a nuclear weapon. This fundamental disagreement has been a constant source of tension. Trump's latest warning explicitly ties the current military crisis to this nuclear standoff, presenting it as the ultimate justification for potential action and framing the conflict in existential terms. The people of the region are caught in the middle of this high-stakes geopolitical chess game. In both Iran and Israel, civilians were already facing the terrifying reality of war, Scenes of families fleeing major cities seeking refuge from the relentless missile attacks had become commonplace. Air raid sirens were a part of daily life, and the psychological toll was immense. Trump's warning to evacuate Tehran only amplified this existing climate of fear, turning a city of millions into a focal point of global anxiety. The human cost of this conflict was already mounting, and the threat of a wider war promised to make a terrible situation catastrophically worse for ordinary people on all sides. The stage for Donald Trump's dramatic warning was not the Oval Office, but the international arena of the G7 summit. Leaders from the world's most powerful democracies, the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, and Japan, had gathered in Canada to discuss pressing global issues. These meetings are typically highly structured, choreographed events focused on economic policy, climate change, and international security. However, the escalating crisis in the Eastern Mediterranean quickly overshadowed the planned agenda. The raw, unfolding conflict between Iran and Israel demanded immediate attention, pulling focus from long-term strategic discussions and forcing leaders to confront an urgent, real-time threat that could destabilize the entire global order. Even before his public ultimatum, Trump had used the G7 platform to signal his administration's hardening stance. He had engaged his counterparts in discussions about the necessity of preventing Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons, reiterating his long-held belief that the existing nuclear deal was insufficient. He reportedly predicted to fellow leaders that Iran, under immense pressure, would eventually have no choice but to agree to a new, more stringent deal on his terms. This foreshadowed the coercive diplomacy that was to follow, blending the threat of military force with the offer of a negotiated settlement. His primary message at the summit was one of resolve. Iran's nuclear ambitions would be checked one way or another. The most telling sign of the crisis's gravity was Trump's sudden and unexpected decision to cut his G7 trip short. While world leaders continued their deliberations, he made a swift departure, heading back to Washington, D.C. This abrupt exit sent a powerful message to allies and adversaries alike. It signaled that the situation had reached a critical inflection point, demanding the president's full attention and the marshaling of America's national security apparatus. The flight back to the United States was not just a journey across continents, it was a symbolic transition from multilateral diplomacy to unilateral action, setting the stage for the significant decisions that would be made upon his return to the White House. Upon landing, it was clear that the focus was singular: the burgeoning war in the Eastern Mediterranean. A series of high-stakes meetings were immediately scheduled with top military and national security advisors. The atmosphere in Washington was thick with tension as the administration prepared to respond to the rapidly deteriorating situation. The world watched, understanding that the decisions made in those rooms would have far-reaching consequences. Trump's return from Canada wasn't just a change in itinerary, it was the prelude to a potential shift in U.S. policy from observer to active participant, moving the world one step closer to a wider and more devastating conflict. Upon his return to American soil, Donald Trump wasted no time in unleashing his first, deeply aggressive public statement. It came not through a formal press conference or a presidential address, but via the unfiltered, direct medium of social media, ensuring it would be seen instantly across the globe. The message was a direct and terrifying warning to the citizens of Iran: evacuate your capital city, Tehran. This was not a diplomatic suggestion or a veiled threat. It was a stark, public command that carried the implicit promise of overwhelming military force. The statement was designed to create maximum psychological pressure, not just on the Iranian leadership, but on the millions of ordinary people who called Tehran home. Trump's social media post laid out his justification for such an extreme measure. He explicitly tied the warning to Iran's nuclear program, framing the entire crisis around this single issue. "I had told Iran to sign the nuclear deal," he wrote, casting their refusal as a grave miscalculation. "They should have done this." He presented his repeated requests as a series of spurned opportunities for peace, portraying Iran's leadership as reckless gamblers who were disgracefully risking the lives of their own people. The core of his argument was a simple, non-negotiable bottom line: Iran cannot, under any circumstances, acquire nuclear weapons. The message was a masterclass in brinkmanship, escalating the rhetoric to an unprecedented level. The public declaration to evacuate an entire capital city of a sovereign nation was a shocking move that reverberated through international diplomatic circles. It bypassed traditional channels of communication, speaking directly to the Iranian populace and, by extension, to the world. The intent seemed twofold. First, it aimed to sow fear and division within Iran, potentially turning public opinion against the government by suggesting that their leader's intransigence was placing them in mortal danger. Second, it served as a clear and unmistakable signal to the Israeli government and other regional allies that the United States was prepared to take decisive action, lending American credibility to the possibility of a massive military intervention. The language used was deliberately forceful and devoid of diplomatic nuance. By telling millions of civilians to flee, Trump was painting a grim picture of what might come next. The statement was an implicit announcement that Tehran itself could become a target in a potential military campaign. This was a significant escalation from previous U.S. policy, which had typically focused on sanctions and covert actions rather than public threats of direct, large-scale attacks on civilian centers. The world was now confronted with the terrifying possibility that this was not just political posturing, but a genuine prelude to an attack that could reshape the Middle East and trigger a global crisis of immense proportions. The impact of Trump's statement in Tehran was immediate and honestly quite profound. While some level of evacuation had already been underway due to the ongoing missile exchanges with Israel, the explicit warning from the American president injected a new and potent strain of fear into the city's atmosphere. The threat was no longer a generalized risk of war, it was a specific named danger directed at the heart of the nation. News of the social media post spread like wildfire through the capital, transmitted via messaging apps and word of mouth, creating a palpable sense of anxiety and uncertainty among its nearly 9 million residents. The question on everyone's mind was no longer if the war would worsen, but when and how badly. Visual evidence soon emerged, seemingly confirming the exodus. News reports and social media channels began showing footage of highways clogged with vehicles as residents attempted to leave the city. Long lines formed at gas stations, and the roads leading out of Tehran were choked with traffic, creating scenes of controlled chaos. These were not just the wealthy or well-connected leaving. Families from all walks of life were packing what they could into cars and buses, heading for the relative safety of smaller towns and rural areas. This movement was a reactive, fear-driven migration, a stark contrast to any government-organized and orderly evacuation. It was a city bracing for the worst, acting on a threat delivered from thousands of miles away. The Iranian government, meanwhile, was thrust into a difficult position. It had to manage the growing public panic while also projecting an image of strength and defiance in the face of American threats. State media outlets attempted to downplay the warning, portraying it as psychological warfare and a sign of American desperation. Officials urged citizens to remain calm and trust in the nation's defenses. Yet behind the scenes, they were undoubtedly grappling with the logistical and security nightmare of a potential mass exodus from the nation's political and economic hub. The government's challenge was to prevent Trump's words from becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy of chaos and collapse within their own capital. This wave of fear was precisely the intended effect of Trump's strategy. By targeting the civilian population with his warning, he was waging a psychological war designed to cripple the country from within. The goal was to destabilize the Iranian regime by demonstrating to its people that their leaders' policies were leading them toward a catastrophic conflict with a superpower. The scenes of families fleeing Tehran were a powerful visual testament to the effectiveness of this tactic. They illustrated how a single message, amplified by modern technology, could transcend borders and directly impact the lives of millions, turning a distant political conflict into an immediate, personal, and terrifying reality. The terrifying reality of modern warfare is that its front lines are rarely confined to distant battlefields. They often cut directly through the heart of civilian life. While Trump's warning had sent a fresh wave of panic through Tehran, the phenomenon of civilian displacement was already a grim, established feature of this escalating conflict. In Iran, the sight of families leaving major urban centers was becoming increasingly common. This was not just a reaction to a single threat from Washington, but a cumulative response to the ongoing Israeli missile strikes. People were moving away from anticipated targets, military installations, government buildings, and critical infrastructure, and seeking refuge in smaller towns and villages, hoping to find safety away from the epicenters of the conflict. This mass movement was mirrored on the other side of the conflict, creating a tragic symmetry of fear. In Israel, citizens were also on the move, fleeing from the constant barrage of Iranian missiles. The sense of security, once a hallmark of Israeli life, had been shattered. Major cities were no longer seen as safe havens but as primary targets. Reports and images from airports showed scenes of frantic departure, with Israeli citizens desperately trying to book flights out of the country. The demand was so high that leaving by air became a privilege for the few. This created a two-front exodus, with ordinary people in both nations becoming refugees in their own lands, driven by the same fundamental instinct to escape the line of fire. The nature of the displacement highlighted the differing anxieties on each side. For Iranians, the fear was compounded by the threat of a superpower's intervention, a fear amplified by Trump's direct warning. The potential for a devastating air campaign against their capital city added a new dimension to their calculus of risk. For Israelis, the shock was perhaps more profound. They were confronting a level of direct, sustained attack on their homeland that had not been seen in generations. The psychological impact of rockets falling on their cities, evading sophisticated defense systems, was immense. This created a shared human experience of vulnerability, connecting the two populations in a way that their political leaders never could. The narrative being presented by global media outlets like the Times of Israel and Haaretz was one of impending decision. They framed the situation as a critical juncture where the United States would have to make a choice, either formally enter the war on Israel's side or broker an immediate and lasting ceasefire. This analysis, however, sometimes overlooked the complex ground reality. The retaliatory strikes from Iran were not merely symbolic, they were inflicting real damage and sowing widespread fear. The scenes of civilians fleeing from both Tehran and Tel Aviv painted a much more nuanced picture of a conflict where both sides were paying a heavy price, and the human cost was escalating daily, regardless of the high-level geopolitical maneuvering. In the shadow of any major conflict, a parallel economy of desperation and exploitation inevitably emerges. As civilians in Israel grew more frantic to escape the relentless missile attacks, a grim marketplace for safe passage began to thrive. Those unable to secure a flight turned to other, more dangerous routes. The sea became a potential escape path, with many looking towards the nearby island of Cyprus, a territory divided between Turkish and Greek control. Unscrupulous boat operators began offering passage at exorbitant prices, preying on the fear of families willing to pay anything for a chance at safety. These perilous journeys across the Mediterranean were a gamble, a desperate bid to trade one set of dangers for another. The land routes out of Israel were equally fraught. Those with means attempted to drive to neighboring countries, but this was not a simple undertaking. Border crossings were jammed, and the journey itself was uncertain. Here, too, a wartime economy took hold. Smugglers and opportunistic guides offered their services, demanding hefty sums to navigate safe passage through treacherous terrain and bypass official checkpoints. A successful crossing often depended on paying significant amounts of money to a chain of individuals, each taking their cut. This created a grim business of war, where human fear became a commodity, and the pathway to safety was paved with the life savings of those trying to flee. This exodus was not just a story of escape, it was also a story of immense profit for a select few. The business of war is notoriously lucrative, and this conflict was no exception. From the arms manufacturers supplying the missiles to the smugglers guiding families across borders, many individuals and entities stood to gain financially from the escalating violence. This dark underbelly of the conflict highlighted the stark contrast between those who suffer and those who profit from war. While ordinary families were losing their homes, their savings, and their sense of security, others were capitalizing on the chaos, turning human suffering into a source of immense personal wealth and creating a powerful, hidden incentive for the conflict to continue. The visuals captured this desperate flight in stark detail. In Iran, long convoys of cars snaked their way out of the cities, their occupants carrying whatever possessions they could fit. In Israel, similar scenes unfolded, with people attempting to escape by any means necessary, by air, sea, or rugged land routes. The images of people trekking through rocky landscapes or crowded onto small boats served as a powerful testament to the human cost of the conflict. They were a visceral reminder that behind the political rhetoric and military strategy, the war was being fought and felt by ordinary people who were being forced to make impossible choices in a desperate, high-stakes scramble for survival. Amidst the escalating threats between Washington and Tehran, another global power made its voice heard, adding a new layer of complexity to the diplomatic crisis. China, a nation with significant economic and strategic interests in the region, issued its own urgent advisory. Beijing strongly advised its citizens currently in Israel to leave the country immediately. This was a significant and public declaration, signaling China's grave concern about the stability of the entire region and its belief that the conflict was likely to worsen considerably. The advisory was a clear indication that China did not see a swift resolution on the horizon and was taking proactive steps to protect its own people from the expanding violence. The Chinese government's instructions were remarkably specific and underscored the seriousness of the situation. Beijing informed its nationals that if commercial flights were unavailable, a growing reality as airlines began canceling routes into the conflict zone, they should attempt to travel by land to neighboring Jordan. This directive suggested that China's intelligence assessment painted a grim picture of Israel's immediate future, one where even land borders might become impassable. This move by a major world power to evacuate its citizens from a key U.S. ally served as a powerful, independent verification of the extreme danger that now permeated the region, amplifying the sense of a crisis spiraling out of control. Following this practical advice, the Chinese Foreign Ministry released a formal statement addressing the broader geopolitical situation. The spokesman articulated a position of strong opposition to any actions that threatened the sovereignty and security of Iran. The statement read, "We strongly reject any actions that threaten Iran's sovereignty, security, and territorial integrity, and any attempts to escalate tensions in the region." This was a clear, albeit indirect, rebuke of the threats emanating from the United States. China expressed its deep concerns about the situation in the Eastern Mediterranean, positioning itself as a defender of national sovereignty and a voice for de-escalation, in stark contrast to the confrontational rhetoric employed by Trump. China's intervention was a critical development. As a permanent member of the UN Security Council and a major economic partner to many countries in the Middle East, including Iran, its position carried significant weight. The statement was not just diplomatic posturing. It was a signal to Washington that any military action against Iran would be met with strong international opposition from at least one global superpower. This move complicated the American strategic calculus, introducing a powerful new variable into an already volatile equation. It demonstrated that the conflict was no longer a purely bilateral affair between Iran and Israel, with the U.S. as a potential participant, but a global issue with the potential to draw in other major players. As the rhetoric from Washington intensified, a significant counter-narrative began to form within the Muslim world. In a powerful display of unity, a coalition of 21 Islamic nations came together to issue a joint declaration. This was not merely a statement of concern, it was a direct condemnation of what they termed Israeli aggression on Iran. The declaration, disseminated widely through international news agencies, represented a coordinated diplomatic front against the ongoing military strikes and the escalating tensions. It was a clear signal that a significant portion of the Islamic world was aligning itself with Iran, at least rhetorically, creating a formidable bloc of opposition to the actions of Israel and its powerful American ally. The list of signatories to this declaration was noteworthy for its breadth and regional significance. It included major Sunni powers like Saudi Arabia and Egypt, Gulf states such as Qatar, Kuwait, the UAE, and Bahrain, as well as influential nations like Pakistan and Turkey. The inclusion of these countries was particularly striking, as many of them have historically had complex and sometimes strained relationships with Shia-led Iran. Their decision to stand together on this issue underscored the depth of regional opposition to the escalating conflict and the perceived threat of a wider war. It demonstrated that the direct military confrontation between Israel and Iran was capable of transcending traditional sectarian and political divides. This collective statement served as a crucial morale booster for Tehran. At a time when Iran was facing immense pressure from both military attacks and severe international threats, this public display of support from its neighbors and other Muslim nations was invaluable. It provided a sense of legitimacy to Iran's position on the world stage and served as a diplomatic shield against further isolation. For the Iranian government, it was proof that they were not alone in this fight and that their resistance to what they framed as Israeli aggression resonated across the Islamic world. This solidarity, even if only on paper, was a significant strategic asset in the unfolding psychological and political war. Conversely, the declaration presented a complex diplomatic challenge for Israel and the United States. While Trump's aggressive posturing may have energized Israel's resolve, this unified stance from 21 nations served as a powerful counterweight. It complicated the narrative that this was a simple case of a rogue state being held in check. Instead, it framed the conflict as one that pitted Israel and the U.S. against a broad coalition of Islamic countries. This development made any potential military action far more politically fraught, raising the diplomatic stakes and risking a much broader regional backlash that could alienate key American allies and destabilize the entire Middle East for years to come. Among the 21 signatories, the inclusion of Jordan was arguably the most significant and surprising development. Jordan, a key Western ally and a nation that maintains a formal peace treaty with Israel, found itself in an incredibly precarious position. In the initial stages of the conflict, the Jordanian government had taken action that appeared to favor Israel, reportedly using its air defenses to intercept Iranian drones and missiles that passed through its airspace. This move was widely interpreted as an effort to protect its own sovereignty and, implicitly, to aid its Israeli neighbor. The kingdom was walking a diplomatic tightrope, trying to avoid being drawn directly into the conflict while managing its complex web of regional alliances. The decision to then join the collective condemnation of Israeli aggression marked a notable public shift in Jordan's posture. This change was likely driven by immense internal and external pressures. The majority of Jordan's population has Palestinian roots, and public sentiment runs strongly against Israeli military actions. For the monarchy in Amman, ignoring this powerful domestic feeling would be politically perilous. By signing the declaration, the Jordanian government was attempting to placate its own citizens and align itself with the broader Arab and Islamic consensus. It was a calculated move to balance its strategic ties with the West against the undeniable realities of its domestic and regional political environment. This balancing act highlights the intricate and often contradictory pressures faced by moderate Arab states during such crises. On one hand, Jordan relies heavily on American security and economic aid, and its peace treaty with Israel is a cornerstone of its foreign policy. On the other hand, it cannot afford to be seen as a silent partner to what much of the region views as unacceptable aggression against a fellow Muslim nation. The kingdom's signature on the declaration was a masterclass in diplomatic maneuvering, a way to voice dissent and express solidarity with the Islamic world without fundamentally severing its crucial ties with Israel and the United States. For Iran, Jordan's inclusion in the declaration was a significant diplomatic victory. It fractured the perception of a unified front of pro-Western Arab states tacitly supporting action against Tehran. It suggested that even America's closest allies in the region had their limits and would not offer unconditional support for a policy of open-ended escalation against Iran. This development added another layer of complexity to the strategic map, demonstrating that alliances in the Middle East are fluid and highly conditional. Jordan's move was a potent reminder that in a region rife with historical grievances and popular passions, strategic calculations must always account for the powerful currents of public opinion. Just as the list of signatories to the Islamic Declaration was revealing, so too was the list of those who were absent. Several key countries were conspicuously missing, and their silence spoke volumes about the complex and fractured state of regional politics. Syria, a nation deeply enmeshed in a long-standing alliance with Iran, was not included. This was a particularly glaring omission, but it was explained by recent shocking reports that the Syrian government had announced its support for Israel. This stunning reversal suggested that the pressures of its own long-running civil war had forced Damascus into an unthinkable realignment, leaving its traditional partner, Iran, isolated on that front. Other significant Muslim-majority nations were also absent from the list. Indonesia and Malaysia, the two most populous Muslim countries in Southeast Asia, had not yet joined the declaration. Their initial silence suggested a more cautious wait-and-see approach. Similarly, Afghanistan, a country sharing a long and often porous border with Iran, was not mentioned. Its new government was likely preoccupied with its own immense internal challenges. The silence from the Muslim-majority republics of Central Asia, such as Turkmenistan and Azerbaijan, was equally notable. Azerbaijan, in particular, has developed close security and economic ties with Israel, creating a complicated dynamic with its southern neighbor Iran. These nations were likely hesitant to commit to a side. Their neutrality was a strategic choice, reflecting a desire to maintain stable relations with all parties. These absences paint a more nuanced picture of the so-called Muslim world's response. While the declaration of the 21 nations was a powerful symbol of solidarity, the silence of others revealed deep fissures and competing interests. It showed that support for Iran was not monolithic, and that national interests often outweighed broader religious solidarity. The conflict was forcing every nation to make difficult choices, and the resulting patchwork revealed a geopolitical landscape that was far more complex and unpredictable than it first appeared. In times of war, the first casualty is often the truth, but it is the journalists on the ground who risk everything to report it. The conflict between Iran and Israel was no exception, with media coverage becoming a battleground in its own right. A particularly striking moment of this struggle was captured on Iranian state television, offering a raw, unfiltered glimpse into the reality of life in a city under attack. During a live broadcast, a female news anchor, Sahar Imam, was reporting on the unfolding events when the studio was violently shaken by a massive nearby explosion. The blast was powerful enough to knock items off shelves and fill the air with the unmistakable sound of a missile or bomb striking perilously close. The anchor's reaction was a testament to the immense pressure faced by those reporting from a conflict zone. In the immediate aftermath of the explosion, the shock and danger were palpable. She momentarily paused, stood up, and moved out of the frame as the live feed was briefly disrupted, a natural human response to a life-threatening event. However, what followed was a remarkable display of professional fortitude and personal courage. When the broadcast resumed shortly thereafter, Sahar Imam had returned to her desk, now joined by a male colleague, and calmly continued with the news report. This act of resilience was a powerful statement in itself, a defiance against the terror of the attacks. This moment was more than just a dramatic television clip. It was a deliberate part of Iran's broader information strategy. By showcasing the bravery of its journalists and citizens, the Iranian government aimed to project an image of a nation unbowed by foreign aggression. The message was clear. The Iranian people were not afraid, but were instead confronting the situation with courage and resolve. It was an attempt to counter the narrative of panic and fear that threats like Trump's were designed to create. The image of the anchor returning to her post was symbolic of a national effort to maintain a sense of normalcy and control, even as the world around them descended into chaos and violence. This incident also highlighted the immense human cost of the conflict, extending beyond military targets and casualties. It underscored the psychological toll on civilians and the bravery required to simply carry on with daily life under the constant threat of attack. While international media focused on geopolitics and military strategy, this moment brought the human angle of the war into sharp focus. The courage displayed by this single journalist served as a microcosm of the broader Iranian effort to resist, not just with missiles and air defenses, but with an unwavering determination to not be broken by the fear and uncertainty of war. While Iran projected an image of civilian resilience, its military was engaged in a retaliatory campaign of unprecedented scale and intensity. The attacks launched against Israel were not sporadic or merely symbolic. They represented the most significant direct assault the country had faced in over half a century. This reality was not just Iranian propaganda. It was being extensively reported in Israeli newspapers and global media outlets, which detailed the scope and impact of the missile barrages. The sheer volume of munitions fired and the strategic nature of the targets chosen marked a clear and deliberate escalation by Tehran, signaling a new phase in their military doctrine and a willingness to engage in direct, sustained confrontation with a powerful adversary. The Iranian strategy appeared to be one of gradual but relentless intensification. Rather than unleashing their full arsenal at once, they seemed to be adopting a tactical approach of slowly ramping up the pressure. This was confirmed by statements from Iranian security forces who had declared their intention to make it a day of reckoning for Israel. Following this proclamation, a clear pattern emerged. At intervals of just 1 or 2 hours, new waves of missiles were launched towards Israeli territory. This sustained, methodical assault was designed to overwhelm Israel's sophisticated air defense systems and maintain a constant state of high alert and psychological stress across the nation, disrupting civilian life and military operations. The choice of targets was highly strategic and aimed at inflicting maximum damage on Israel's critical infrastructure. Iranian missiles reportedly struck significant energy facilities, including nuclear power plants in the Haifa region. Alarming visuals began to surface, showing massive fires and widespread devastation at these sensitive sites. The images of enormous explosions and raging infernos were a stark testament to the destructive power of the weapons being deployed. By targeting the foundations of Israel's energy sector, Iran was not only causing immediate economic and logistical damage, but also striking at the very heart of the nation's industrial and technological prowess, demonstrating a new level of strategic capability. Throughout this escalating campaign, Iranian officials maintained a confident and defiant posture. They repeatedly claimed that the weapons used so far were only a fraction of their total capabilities, ominously suggesting that they had many more advanced systems yet to be deployed. This rhetoric was a clear warning that they were prepared to escalate the conflict even further if Israeli attacks continued. At this moment, it was undeniable that Iran was on the offensive, aggressively launching attacks and dictating the pace of the retaliation. This assertive military stance, combined with the psychological warfare of threatening even greater destruction, placed immense pressure on Israel and its international partners to find a way to de-escalate the crisis. Amid the torrent of news about missile strikes and diplomatic maneuvers, a specific and potentially game-changing claim emerged from Tehran. Iranian military sources began asserting that their air defense systems had successfully shot down a fourth Israeli F-35 fighter jet. This was not a minor assertion, it was a bombshell in the world of military aviation and strategic warfare. The F-35, a product of American ingenuity, is the pinnacle of modern air power. It's a fifth-generation stealth fighter utilized by the U.S. military and its closest allies, and is widely considered to be one of the most advanced and survivable aircraft ever built. The claim was, in essence, that Iran had done the impossible. The significance of this claim cannot be overstated. Prior to this conflict, the F-35 had a near-mythical reputation for invincibility in combat scenarios, with its stealth technology designed to make it virtually invisible to enemy radar. If Iran's claims were true, it would mean they had become the first country in the world to successfully shoot down one of these prized aircraft in combat. Such an event would send shockwaves through the global defense community, instantly devaluing a multi-trillion-dollar weapons program and forcing a complete re-evaluation of modern air combat doctrine. It would be a massive technological and propaganda victory for Iran, demonstrating a defensive capability far beyond what most international analysts believed they possessed. Naturally, the claim was met with intense skepticism and a lack of independent verification. Israel and the United States remained silent, refusing to confirm or deny the loss of such a valuable asset. This silence, however, only fueled speculation. Was it a bluff? A piece of propaganda designed to boost morale at home and sow doubt among its enemies? Or was it a closely guarded secret, an embarrassing and strategically significant loss that both Israel and the U.S. were desperate to conceal? Without wreckage or confirmation from Western sources, the claim remained in a state of ambiguity, but its psychological impact was already being felt, adding a new layer of uncertainty to the conflict. This unsubstantiated claim fit perfectly into Iran's broader narrative, that they possessed the means to counter even the most advanced Western military technology. Whether true or not, the story of the downed F-35 served as a powerful symbol of Iranian resistance and ingenuity. It suggested that any potential military intervention, even one led by the United States, would not be a simple affair. It propagated the idea that Iran was not a defenseless target, but a formidable adversary capable of inflicting significant costs on any attacker. The controversy surrounding the F-35 became another front in the information war, a potent myth that challenged the very notion of American and Israeli technological supremacy. In any potential large-scale military conflict, the positioning of neighboring countries is a critical factor, often determining the feasibility and success of an intervention. For the United States and Israel, contemplating a broader war against Iran, the current geopolitical landscape presents a formidable array of obstacles, not allies. This situation stands in stark contrast to previous American-led military campaigns in the region. The neighborhood surrounding Iran is not a welcoming theater for an invading force. Instead, it's a complex patchwork of nations who are, for a variety of strategic, economic, and political reasons, unwilling to provide the logistical support or airspace necessary for a sustained attack on Iran. This regional resistance forms a powerful, albeit passive, line of defense for Tehran. Looking at the map, the challenges become immediately apparent. To the north, Russia, a major global power and competitor to the United States, holds significant influence and would almost certainly oppose any American military buildup in its backyard. The bordering nations of Azerbaijan and Turkmenistan, while navigating their own complex relationships with Iran, are unlikely to risk destabilizing their own security by allowing their territory to be used as a staging ground for an American attack. To the west, Turkey, a NATO member but an increasingly independent and assertive regional player, has already issued statements condemning Israeli aggression. It's almost unthinkable that Ankara would grant access to its bases or airspace for a war it publicly opposes, creating a significant barrier from the northwest. The situation to Iran's immediate west and south is equally complicated for any potential aggressor. Iraq, which shares a long and deeply integrated border with Iran, is heavily influenced by pro-Iranian factions and has already joined the chorus of condemnation. It would not, and likely could not, permit American forces to attack Iran from its soil. Further south, the Gulf states, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, Oman, and Saudi Arabia, have all signed the Joint Declaration of Solidarity. While some host American military bases, their public alignment with Iran in this crisis makes active participation or even passive support for an attack politically untenable. They're acutely aware that any conflict would place them directly in the line of fire of Iranian retaliation, a risk their leadership is unwilling to take. This wall of regional opposition leaves the United States with very few viable options for projecting force. Unlike past conflicts where a coalition of willing neighbors provided crucial logistical hubs, this time, America would find itself largely isolated. The primary avenues of attack would be limited to long-range bombers, carrier strike groups operating in the Arabian Sea, and a direct partnership with Israel. This lack of regional basing support dramatically increases the logistical complexity and cost of any military operation. It turns what might have been a regional conflict into a far more difficult and protracted long-distance campaign, fundamentally altering the strategic calculus for Washington and Jerusalem. The U.S. invasion of Afghanistan in 2001 was enabled by global support and regional cooperation, conditions that simply don't exist today around Iran. Now, the U.S. faces resistance from every neighbor. Pakistan and India both refuse to help, and there's no international consensus for war. Unlike Afghanistan, Iran hasn't attacked the U.S. directly, making it nearly impossible to justify intervention or build a coalition. Any attack on Iran would be seen as an aggressive move, not self-defense, isolating America and raising the risks dramatically. A war with Iran would be far more costly and uncertain than anything seen in Afghanistan or Iraq, a warning echoed by U.S. military experts. Iran's military strategy is built on asymmetric warfare, not conventional strength. Its air force is outdated, but